Welcome to YOUCANIC. In this video we're going to show you how to replace a rear wheel bearing on a vehicle. So right here we have a 2019 Mitsubishi Outlander, and this setup is very common in many makes and models. So by watching this video you'll be able to have a good understanding of the steps required to change a rear wheel bearing. In addition, this vehicle has a rear wheel drive, so that makes it a little bit more challenging and complicated. But the good thing is that most vehicles today are not wheel drive. And even if it is, you'll see what it takes to replace it. If your vehicle is front wheel drive, this is going to be even a little bit easier, as you will not need to remove the axle nut here and disconnect the axle. But in either case, you'll be prepared to replace the rear wheel bearing on a vehicle. One of the most common symptoms of a bad wheel bearing is a whining noise as your speed increases, or a whine as you go take a turn. That's more common with front end, but it can affect the rear wheel bearings as well. So as you take a turn to the right, you might hear the noise, the whine, but then you go in the other direction, that noise goes away. So the first thing that you'll need to do is secure the vehicle. Make sure you're parked on level ground, because you will be loosening a lot of bolts, using a lot of torque, and you don't want the vehicle to roll. Once you park the vehicle, make sure to have it in park and set the parking brakes for now. And the next step will be to go ahead and block the wheels on the diagonal to the wheel that you're working on. So put wheel chocks if possible, or just put blocks on the front and the back of the wheel on the opposite diagonal position. So that will make sure that the vehicle is not rolling back and forth as you're trying to get these nuts and bolts loose. The next thing you will need to do is loosen up the lug nuts without raising up the vehicle. Don't remove them yet, just break them loose, and then you use a jack to raise the vehicle right there. But do not rely just on the jack. You have to put jack stands and put those underneath and support the frame. Once you do that, then go ahead and loosen up and remove the lug nuts or lug studs, whatever is in your vehicle, and then take the wheel off and slide the wheel underneath, just like as another safety precaution. You should always have a jack stand, and it also helps to have the wheel underneath the vehicle, just like that. Be careful. Use the outside of the wheel, the inside, and slide that on the ground, because otherwise you'll scratch your wheel. Next, what we'll need to do is we have the nut here for the axle. And now, if you do have a front-wheel drive vehicle, you're not going to have this nut here, so you'll just basically skip this step. But this nut is going to be on all rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive, all Formatic, Quattro, four-wheel drive, and all those vehicles will have this. So you'll need to loosen the nut before you do anything else. So the thing to keep in mind is that these nuts, they get indented here and they get pushed in, so they don't come loose easily. And you need to pop out this indent. As you can see here, this was just tapped in on a channel. So you could either use a small flathead screwdriver to put between the nut and the channel. Should be a channel, not threads, but a dedicated channel right there. And then you tap it with a hammer. And then what that will do is they'll take out the dent and will allow you to, this was pushed in, pressed in right there, and once you tap this out, you're basically making this round again, and that will make it easy to remove this nut. Now this nut is going to be a 30, 32, could be up to a 36 millimeter nut. So to get this loose, you're going to need a breaker bar, and you also need quite a bit of force. So make sure get your socket, breaker bar, and then do not pull this up, but you want to be on this side where you push down, and then it could help to get maybe an extension here, cheater pipe to extend the breaker bar, because this does require quite a bit of force. So once you get that loose, you can basically remove this nut. Now the next step is we need to remove the brake caliper and bracket. Now you don't need to remove this part of the brake caliper. but you can remove the whole bracket. It just has 2 bolts on the back here. We have 2 bolts. They're going to be more like 17mm bolts. They come right through there. So you will come and get those bolts loose. So the bolts will be there. The other one will be there, one will be there. And then once you take those bolts out, what you can do is you can simply slide the whole brake caliper away. Now, one thing to be very careful is that the brake caliper has a brake hose, and you don't want to just let this hang. If your vehicle is low enough, you can rest it on the ground as long as it's not putting any tension on the brake hose. But if your vehicle is raised enough, then what you will do is you will take the brake caliper, so you can hang it right there by the spring. Once you do that, then here in this case we have electric parking brakes, so we had to disconnect this. You simply press on the connector and then pull this away. You might have ABS wires that have brackets, secure them to the brake caliper. You need to take those off as well. But that's it. You take out the brake caliper and put that aside. Here we're not replacing pads or rotors or anything else, just the wheel bearing. And the next step is, here we got to remove the rotor. As you can see here, this rotor, this is a pretty new car, so it's not really too much rust. They get a lot worse than this. You'll notice that yours will probably have a set screw, one small screw there. In some cases you'll have 2. This vehicle doesn't even have 1. But you would want to spray some penetrating oil right around here on these studs and just wait about 15 minutes. And what we'll do now is we will go ahead and tap it on the back here with a hammer. And you want to use a rubber mallet, actually, because if you were using the same rotors and you hit this on the back with a hammer, you're gonna cause dents and pitting on the back here, and you could cause wrapping as well. So make sure you're using a rubber mallet. And then the other thing is, here is the next step. You might need to rotate the wheel. So in this point you can put the vehicle in neutral and also release the parking brake. But you need to be extremely careful, because if you haven't secured the wheels, the vehicle is going to roll and it can crush and injure you. So that's a very important step, and you got to be 100% secure and make sure that the vehicle is not going to roll. Block more than one wheel if you feel safe. Here we just blocked one wheel with wheel chucks, and that's pretty secure. We have jack stand, and we have slid the wheel under the vehicle, so this is pretty safe in our case. So here you take out the set screws from the rotor, you tap this, and then this rotor comes off. Okay, so that comes off, and then you can see the wheel bearing. Now this is the dust shield. So the next step will be to come back here and access the bolts for the wheel bearing here. For this, make sure put your vehicle back in park and set the parking brakes in case you release those to get off, to rotate the wheel, to get off the rotor. So that, because what we'll need to do here, we'll need to come through the back here and get these bolts. There's 4 bolts, and you're gonna need to use different size extensions for your ratchet wrench, just depending on the vehicle. These bolts can be very easy to access, can be a little bit of pain as well. So make sure that you got a couple different extensions from 1 inch up to 4 inch, and maybe even a 6 inch in some vehicles, but you can use a couple of extensions together. But then you have the bolts on the back, and we have removed the bolts. You see the bolt right here. Now these bolts, it's recommended to replace these, and also when you reinstall this, it's important to torque them to spec. So keep that in mind as well. So we have removed all the bolts. This is the wrench that we used. Some we had to come away from back here. The other one we had to come through here with a shorter extension. The other one had to do it right here, and the other one was right up here. But there's 4, 2 on top, 2 on bottom. Once you get that loose, and then you also of course remove the nut here, then you can see that you simply can pop this off. Okay, now the splines on the axle might be a little bit tricky and might give you cause a little bit of resistance to pull this off. But if you are going to tap, make sure that if you tap this right here in the center to push the axle in order to pull this out, make sure that you're not hitting on the threads. So just hit that with right on the center with a tool that's going to just push the axle and not damage the threads around. Alright, so do that there. So you're gonna need to hammer that probably a little bit, but then once you remove that, you can go ahead and remove the wheel bearing. Now this dust shield, be careful with this. It's very easy to bend. If you do bend this, you put everything back together, you're gonna start hearing grinding noise because this is gonna rub against the rotor. So keep that in mind. And then I'm gonna go ahead and reinstall this. Now right here we have the ABS wheel speed sensor, and before you actually pull this, because some design might be slightly different, what you want to do is you want to go ahead, there's just one bolt for this ABS sensor on the back here. Just take that out just in case, because depending on the design it might interfere with you and not allow you to pull this out, or it might just be fine. But just to be safe, go ahead and remove and plug the ABS wheel speed sensor. We're gonna take the new wheel bearing. Now on the old one, this channel right here was on top, so we want to make sure we reinstall it the same way. And then the next thing is you're gonna have to line this up. Okay, so very easy. And as you can see here though, there's one thing we forgot, and that is this dust shield. This dust shield has multiple holes in it. This can be a little bit confusing because then how do you set it? But there's a pattern here that the old wheel hub left on it, so you can see that. And again, make sure you're installing new bolts. Right, so just gonna set one bolt here and install that by hand just to align things up. Remember to replace these bolts on the back here, and then you also it's recommended to use anti-seize on that so they don't come loose. This would be a dangerous experience if these bolts came loose while you're driving. So when it comes to these bolts, you want to definitely start threading them by hand. Don't use any impact tools or any power tools for these, because what will happen is they may go in at an angle and then you start cross-threading and ruining the threads. It's going to require a little bit more time to just start threading them by hand. It's definitely safer. And you don't need to go all the way, thread it all the way by hand. But as long as you get a few threads going, then you should be good. On the back here we have the ABS wheel speed sensor, and we're going to have to reinstall that. But we have room and usually can access them right from the back. Okay, so now we have installed the bolts on the back. We torque them, and now the next step is to go ahead and install the rotor. Take the rotor, line this up. Now in this case, there's no set screw on this wheel hub, meaning there's no screw, just to help the rotor to just stay in place. Most cars have it, some don't. If yours was actually really rusted and it won't come off, you might have to drill that. You can re-tap that and remake the threads and then put a new set screw, but the whole purpose of the set screw is just to kind of hold the rotor straight up before installation. But that's about it. There's no other functions for it. So as you can see, some manufacturers don't even use them at all. But we'll go ahead, we'll reinstall the rotor. Now the next step is to reinstall the brake caliper. Here's the brake caliper. This is the electrical connector for electric parking brake. We're not going to connect that quite yet. So on the back here, we have the 2 bolts for the brake caliper bracket. You kind of have to move the whole brake caliper around just to get these bolts started. Okay. You want to start these by hand. Don't use any power tools. No air gun here, because again, if you do that, you could easily cross-thread that bolt and damage it. But once you start threading it, then you can use power tools. You still need to torque this. And for more help, just look in our step-by-step guide. We will have torque references, which are going to be typical values. Every manufacturer is slightly different. So what you need to do is probably just call your car manufacturer, your dealer, and say, give them your VIN number, and then they can tell you the various torque specs, or whatever torque spec you're looking for. In this case, this is a 14mm bolt. And remember, you are going to need to torque this bolt to specification. So we went ahead and torqued both of these bolts right here for the brake caliper. Now the next step is to reconnect this electrical connector for the electric parking brake. So we just press that in. You can hear that click and lock in place. As you can see here, the main thing that's left for us to do is reinstall this nut. And when you reinstall this, it's very important to torque this to spec. A lot of times these nuts, the way that you install them, and every manufacturer is different, but you might have to torque it to a specific torque to first value, let's say 100 foot-pounds. They're usually higher than that, but let's say you go to 100 foot-pounds or whatever the owner manuals recommend, and then you have to stop and then give it another like 90-degree turn, and then torque it one more time. But just it's important to just torque this bolt to spec, and then once you torque this to spec, the other thing that you need to do is, if you remember at the beginning, threads here, there's a channel, and we're gonna have to tap that back in there, because that's just a safety measure, just to prevent this nut from coming loose. We're gonna have to torque that, but one thing that I would also like to point out is that this heat shield right here. Be careful when basically you install this, because this bends really easy, and then when you put everything back together, you start driving, you hear that grinding sound, and it's usually this. It's been pushed and it's rubbing against the rotor. So make sure you inspect that, and that's it. We'll go ahead, have to torque this and then tap here to prevent this nut from coming loose. But other than that, that's it. It's pretty straightforward. Now, if you don't have an all-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive vehicle, you're not gonna have this nut here, so you don't even have to worry about that part. So that it's a little bit easier. But if you do, make sure you torque that to spec and then tap it here on the lip, so it goes into the channel so it doesn't come off. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. You will need a couple of hours to get this done. You might run into problems just because the rotors get really rusted, and the set screw, like I said earlier, that can get rusted too and refuse to come off. So it's good to spray some penetrating oil on before you start working, and just wait 15-20 minutes and then try again. That's it. Thank you for watching.